Welcome back to my YouTube channel today, and here is the content of today's video. When the Secretary General of NATO warns that war could spread across Europe, the message travels faster than any missile. It echoes through parliaments, headlines, and living rooms, shaping public consciousness long before evidence is examined. Such warnings are not neutral assessments. They are political acts. They mobilize budgets, justify deployments, and recalibrate public expectations. In moments like these, fear becomes policy. Yet the gravity of the warning demands scrutiny. What precisely is being claimed? That Russia is preparing to attack NATO? That Europe stands on the brink of a continental war? Or that the alliance must brace itself for a prolonged era of confrontation? The distinction matters profoundly because conflating risk with inevitability is how societies slide from vigilance into escalation. NATO's leadership argues that alarm is necessary, that deterrence requires clarity, resolve, and public readiness. In alliance politics, this logic is familiar. A shared sense of threat binds diverse members together, especially when internal unity is strained by economic pressures, political polarization, and uneven defense spending. Fear in this context is not merely a reaction to danger, it is a tool of cohesion. But fear also has a cost. By framing the moment as an impending clash, NATO risks narrowing the political imagination. Diplomatic options appear weaker. Compromise looks like appeasement. Restraint feels like vulnerability. The language of urgency compresses time, encouraging decisions under pressure rather than deliberation. History teaches us that when leaders speak as if war is coming, societies begin to behave as though it must. The Kremlin's response, delivered by spokesperson Dmitry Peskov and reinforced by President Vladimir Putin, rejects the premise outright. Moscow insists that claims of an impending Russian attack on NATO are absurd, lacking both motive and logic. From Russia's perspective, the argument is straightforward. A direct war with NATO would be strategically irrational. An overwhelming confrontation with an alliance far superior in aggregate economic and military power. This denial is not by itself proof of peaceful intent. States routinely downplay aggressive plans, yet neither is NATO's warning proof of imminent danger. What we are witnessing is a collision of narratives rather than a convergence of facts. On one side, an alliance amplifying risk to sustain deterrence, on the other, a state seeking to diffuse alarm while prosecuting a brutal war in Ukraine. The deeper question, therefore, is not whether NATO or Russia is telling the truth, but how fear is being used to shape outcomes. Are warnings calibrated to prevent war or to prepare societies for one? Is deterrence stabilizing the situation or slowly eroding the guardrails that prevent miscalculation? Europe, caught between these narratives, faces a familiar dilemma. It remembers the cost of complacency, but it also remembers the disasters born of panic. The continent's security architecture was built to prevent great power war, not to normalize its expectation. As rhetoric hardens and warnings multiply, the first casualty is often nuance. The second is trust. And when trust erodes, even defensive moves are interpreted as hostile. In such an environment, the danger does not lie solely in intent, but in the accelerating feedback loop between fear, policy, and perception. In geopolitics, the most perilous moments are not when war is planned, but when it is imagined as inevitable. Moscow's rebuttal to NATO's warnings is swift and categorical. Dmitry Peskov, speaking for the Kremlin, dismisses the idea that Russia plans to attack NATO as completely absurd, urging audiences to listen not to speculation, but to President Vladimir Putin himself. After returning from India, Putin reiterated the same message. Russia has neither the intention nor the interest to wage war against Europe. To many in the West, such statements sound like predictable denials. Yet in geopolitics, dismissing them outright risks misunderstanding the strategic logic at play. At the core of Russia's argument lies a simple calculation of power and cost. A direct confrontation with NATO would pit Russia against an alliance whose combined economic output dwarfs its own, whose military reach is global, and whose industrial base, though strained, is still formidable. Even a limited clash would carry catastrophic risks, including rapid escalation to nuclear thresholds. From a purely strategic standpoint, initiating such a war would amount to self-destruction. Great powers, for all their bravado, rarely choose suicide. This does not mean Russia is benign. It is actively waging a devastating war in Ukraine, reshaping borders by force, and challenging the post-Cold War security order. But there is a crucial distinction between regional revisionism and systemic war. Russia's objectives, however brutal, are bounded. Influence in its near abroad, leverage over Ukraine's alignment, and a renegotiation by force of Europe's security architecture. A war with NATO would obliterate those aims rather than secure them. Strategic denial, then, is not merely propaganda. It is an attempt to draw a line between what Moscow is willing to do and what it considers intolerably risky. Russia signals that it will push hard where it believes NATO will not respond militarily. Ukraine, cyber domains, NATO interprets Russia's words through the lens of mistrust. Russia interprets NATO's warnings as preparation for containment or eventual confrontation. Each side believes it is reacting defensively while viewing the other as provocative. The real danger here is not deception, but mirror imaging. Each side assumes the other thinks and calculates the same way it does. In such conditions, even sincere denials can be discounted, and even defensive measures can be read as hostile intent. History reminds us that wars between great powers often begin not with clear plans, but with misread signals. It is whether vigilance without restraint can still preserve peace, or whether it is quietly paving the road to the crisis it fears most. At the heart of today's escalating rhetoric lies a question that few policymakers are willing to confront openly. Is NATO merely deterring a hypothetical Russian threat, or is it participating in a cycle of escalation that increases the very risk it claims to prevent? The answer is neither simple nor comfortable, but it is unavoidable. NATO's strategy rests on the doctrine of deterrence, the belief that overwhelming readiness, visibility, and resolve will dissuade Russia from aggressive action. In theory, deterrence stabilizes. In practice, it depends on precise calibration. Too little, and it invites coercion. Too much, and it becomes indistinguishable from preparation for war. It is in this narrow corridor that today's Europe finds itself. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, NATO has expanded troop deployments along its eastern flank, intensified military exercises, and normalized language that frames long-term confrontation as inevitable. These measures are justified as defensive responses to Russian aggression, yet from Moscow's vantage point, they resemble encirclement and strategic pressure, what one side calls reassurance, the other experiences as provocation. This is not a new dynamic. The Cold War was defined by similar patterns of action and reaction. What is different today is the erosion of stabilizing mechanisms. Arms control treaties have withered. Military-to-military communication channels are thinner. Trust, once damaged, has not been repaired. In such an environment, deterrence becomes fragile, increasingly dependent on assumptions rather than dialogue. Within NATO itself, there is no single consensus. Eastern members, shaped by historical trauma, push for maximal deterrence. Western European states, more exposed to economic and political fallout, worry quietly about escalation. The United States, balancing global commitments from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, seeks to project strength without being drawn into a direct war. These internal divergences are managed rhetorically, but they shape behavior in subtle ways. The danger is not that NATO intends to attack Russia. There is little evidence of such intent. The danger lies in strategic inertia, the tendency of large alliances to continue expanding military posture, because reversing course appears politically risky. Once a narrative of imminent threat takes hold, stepping back feels like weakness. Every deployment becomes precedent. Every warning becomes baseline. In this context, NATO's alarmism may serve short-term cohesion, but undermine long-term stability. By framing the future as one of unavoidable confrontation, the alliance risks closing off diplomatic pathways before they are fully explored. Deterrence slides into self-fulfilling prophecy. Preparing for war makes war more conceivable, more normal, more likely through miscalculation. History teaches that great power conflicts rarely begin with deliberate decisions to fight. They begin when defensive measures accumulate until no side feels safe enough to pause. Today's Europe is drifting toward that threshold, not because war is desired, but because fear has become the organizing principle of policy. The question then is not whether NATO is right to be vigilant. It is whether vigilance without restraint can still preserve peace, or whether it is quietly paving the road to the crisis it fears most. If NATO's warnings are driven by fear of escalation, Russia's response will be driven by fear of encirclement. Yet fear does not automatically translate into reckless aggression. Historically, Moscow's behavior under pressure has followed a consistent pattern: avoid direct war with superior coalitions while expanding pressure through indirect, asymmetric means. The current moment is unlikely to be an exception. Russia understands the arithmetic of power. A conventional attack on NATO would be catastrophic, not only militarily, but politically and economically. Such a move would unite an already uneasy alliance, legitimize every NATO narrative of existential threat, and invite a level of retaliation Russia could not absorb. From Moscow's perspective, that path is irrational. Deterrence, not invasion, is the objective. Instead, Russia is far more likely to respond through calibrated signaling. This may include intensified military exercises near NATO borders, publicized deployments of strategic systems, or rhetorical reminders of nuclear capability. These actions are not preparations for attack. They are messages designed to restore what Moscow perceives as a deteriorating balance of fear. Beyond symbolism, Russia's toolkit favors ambiguity. Cyber operations, information warfare, and covert disruption allow Moscow to impose costs without crossing clear red lines. Such actions exploit a vulnerability in Western systems: attribution, uncertainty. When responsibility is unclear, retaliation becomes politically and legally complex. This ambiguity is not accidental, it is strategic. Russia may also seek to widen the diplomatic geometry of the conflict, deepening ties with China, Iran, and other non-Western partners serves a dual purpose. It signals that Russia is not isolated, and it complicates Western calculations by stretching attention and resources across multiple theaters. In this sense, Russia's response to NATO is global rather than purely European. Crucially, Moscow will frame all these actions as defensive. Russian officials will argue that NATO's posture leaves them no alternative, that deterrence requires counterpressure. Whether one accepts this logic is secondary to understanding its function. It provides domestic legitimacy and international justification for measures that would otherwise appear escalatory. The greatest danger lies not in any single Russian action, but in interaction effects. A Russian cyber operation could provoke a NATO response. A NATO deployment could trigger further Russian signaling. Each step taken in isolation may seem manageable. Together, they form a ladder of escalation that neither side claims to want, but neither side feels able to abandon. In this environment, restraint becomes invisible, while action becomes expected. Russia's likely response, therefore, is not dramatic invasion, but persistent pressure designed to remind NATO that escalation has consequences and that security cannot be achieved unilaterally. History suggests that such standoffs are sustainable only if communication channels remain open and intentions remain testable. Without that, deterrence risks mutating into confrontation, not by design, but by accumulation. The gravest danger facing Europe today is not a secret Russian plan to attack NATO, nor a deliberate Western scheme to provoke war. It is something far more insidious and historically familiar, a slow drift into confrontation driven by fear, rhetoric, and the erosion of strategic imagination. Modern wars between great powers rarely begin with clear declarations. They begin when assumptions harden into certainties and warnings replace dialogue. Each side insists it is acting defensively, yet each action tightens the strategic vice. In such an environment, restraint looks naive, diplomacy appears weak, and escalation becomes normalized, not because leaders desire war, but because they fear the political cost of appearing unprepared. Europe sits uncomfortably at the center of this drift. Its geography makes it the likely battlefield. Its politics make it the most vulnerable to panic. NATO's warnings resonate powerfully with publics already unsettled by economic insecurity and prolonged conflict in Ukraine. Russia's denials, meanwhile, are dismissed as deception, regardless of their strategic plausibility. Between alarm and dismissal, the space for careful judgment narrows. What is missing from the current debate is a credible pathway back to stability. Deterrence without diplomacy is incomplete. Reassurance without communication is brittle. When military postures expand faster than political dialogue, misinterpretation becomes inevitable. A routine exercise is mistaken for preparation. A defensive deployment is read as encirclement. An ambiguous cyber incident is assumed to be hostile. The ladder of escalation is climbed one rung at a time, often without conscious intent. The tragedy is that none of the principal actors stands to gain from a NATO-Russia war. Russia would face overwhelming economic and military pressure. Europe would bear the immediate costs of devastation and instability, the United States would be drawn into a conflict that distracts from its global priorities. Even the logic of deterrence collapses if miscalculation triggers irreversible consequences. History offers sobering lessons. The great catastrophes of the 20th century were not born solely of ambition. They were born of misjudgment, rigid alliances, and leaders who believed they had no alternative. Today's leaders insist they are wiser, more cautious. Perhaps they are. Yet the structures of fear they are building look unsettlingly familiar. The essential question, then, is not whether NATO should defend its members or whether Russia should protect its interests. It is whether the international system still possesses the tools to manage rivalry without sliding into disaster. Can warnings be tempered by dialogue? Can deterrence coexist with de-escalation? Can Europe refuse to become the stage for a conflict born of mutual suspicion? If the answer is no, then the warning signs we see today will not mark the prevention of war, but its prelude. And the most tragic outcome will be this: a conflict that no one truly wanted, but that everyone helped bring into being.